Hi, I'm Tony.
And I'm Patrick.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of Cave to the Cross Apologetics. In this week's episode, we're continuing in our discussion of Mitch Stokes' book on how to be an atheist. And so we have worked our way up to chapter 10. And this chapter finishes the section on science, right? That's where he's headed here.
So if you're getting sick of us talking about quantum mechanics or poorly explaining string theory, which I did receive one message that helped somebody understand it, so there you go. Again, that was probably Mitch Stokes writing, not us, but we muddled our way through it.
Yeah, so this chapter is called God, the Failed Hypothesis, and he wants to now finish up this issue of science and see where we have where it gets us with regard to postulating whether or not God exists.
Right.
Really is what he's getting at.
I think Mitch Stokes is pretty fair in this book, too, because every time he makes a really good point, he goes, well, let's put that aside and let's grant the other person this. So he's granted a lot, and he's going to continue to do so.
So we'll see a lot of granting in this chapter. Right? Okay, this is the problem, this is the problem, but let's just say it's not. Now where does it get us? So he says here, let's suppose that everything that science says about the physical part of the reality, even the part we can't observe, is entirely true, although he's just spent a lot of time talking to us about why we should be skeptical about that stuff, right? So he says, would this show then that there is no God, or that even if there is, he isn't responsible for the cosmos' existence and behavior? And he answers, not obviously, right? And so now what he wants to do here is to walk us through again briefly M theory. You recall that was one of the quantum or theories about the nature of the universe. Mm-hmm. And he says there that Hawkins argued that contemporary physics in the form of M theory makes God superfluous, at least in that God isn't needed to explain the universe's existence and its astonishing complexity and order. And so, mathematics, he says, is what they say tell us that's what M theory is all about. Tells us we are assured that the universe can be created spontaneously out of nothing by quantum fluctuations. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's where it comes from. All right, so that's kind of where he starts here, and that's Hawking's claim and issue, and so he points out several problems with that, right?
So here, Hawking's in trying to nail down existence. Let's see why things exist, why they are the way they are, and why the rules are the way they are. Instead of taking that one dart and trying to hit the bullseye, he just uses 500 darts and says good enough, and that explains it. So eventually, with 500 darts, you're going to hit the bullseye.
Somewhere you
get us. So there you go.
That's right. Even though the bullseye might be there and you're aiming over there, eventually you'll hit it somehow.
And no one believes in 499 other ones that can be tested. It's just assumed.
So he says, unfortunately, things aren't quite as easy as Hawking has suggested. One problem stems from his instrumentalism. Right. As you'll recall, the instrumentalist says something to the effect that, we're not interested in whether or not theories are true. We just want to make sure that they work, right? That they allow for prediction and that sort of thing. Right. So he says one problem is Hawking's instrumentalism, or it's also called non-realism, right? So if he's an instrumentalist, why should we take his arguments seriously? He himself says that we shouldn't believe what science says about unobservables. Yeah. That's the idea of instrumentalism, right? It says, for instance, we don't know whether or not quarks exist. We can't observe them, but we can postulate, perhaps or maybe, as long as they allow us to make predictions and that sort of thing.
Does it work? Yeah, sure. For now, it does.
So if we're to take his scientific authority seriously, shouldn't we take his instrumentalism seriously as well? And so. So that's the first issue. All right, you're an instrumentalist, so how can you speak to whether or not the fact of a particular, whether or not God exists? You're not even sure if non-observables exist, right? So, give me a break here, is really what's going on, right? But he says, and here he goes, right? He's going to put that to the side. He says, but let's ignore that problem and suppose that Hawkins is wrong about instrumentalism and that M theory isn't merely a useful tool, that's what instrumentalist says, for predicting and describing phenomena, right? So would there be anything about M theory then, even with these concessions, that is inconsistent with God's existence or with his ultimate role in the universe's creation? And he says, well, that's hard to see that there would.
Right.
Right? He says, after all, it seems possible that these quantum fluctuations are simply perhaps God's means of creating all these universes ex nihilo, intending that one of them produce humanity.
Right, which we see someone like William Lane Craig use this exact same argument for his own purposes, and clearly he's not discounting God in it. In fact, he's using it to bolster up his claim and his view of who God is and stuff like that. And there are definite problems with utilizing that, but he, at least we can agree that William Lane Craig is not an idiot who's arguing against his own position, in what he considers kind of the best argumentation, especially in light of M theory. He's trying to utilize it, and so here's someone who's using Hawking's own theory kind of against him. So it doesn't follow that God is superfluous or that he doesn't exist, and he goes on to explain about maybe utilizing that kind of evolutionary approach of we'll eventually get it is how God operates. And Craig even puts God even above those multi-universes and said that in pretty much every single universe God is above it. So yeah.
So even though we might hold to it and it might be we might be on the right track there, that doesn't mean that God didn't use that for his own purposes, right? Furthermore, he says, consider all the universes that M theory posits, each one with different physical laws. The vast number of these different legal systems is further legislated by the more fundamental meta laws of M theory, right? But then he asks, why these meta laws? Where did they come from?
Right. I thought this was interesting too, because at some basic factor, Hawkins was saying, here's universals. Like he says, they're meta laws. Yeah. So why, if you can believe in meta laws, why can't you just believe in a single state of universal laws? In this universe, but you don't. The only reason that you need to have meta laws first is that you can't kind of postulate things that are, well, what does the law of non-contradiction look like in universe 357? Well, there sometimes the car is in the garage and sometimes it's not, but it depends if it's Tuesday or not. Then it can be in both places. But the only reason that he's really using this is so he can get away from the fact that the sheer the possibility, the preconditions needed for the universe to bang, to come into existence, to have the universal laws possible,
to operate the way it does,
then to get to us, rains on the rocks for millions of years. Life evolves through a very minute possibility that even they admit. So even if you take for granted all other pieces of his idea of how the universe came to about, he seems to be wanting kind of his cake and eating it too. Yeah. Yep, there are meta universal laws when we talk about 500 universes, but not this one. So.
Yeah, so the issue is, where'd the laws come from, right? And of course you can't rule out God.
Yeah.
Right? He gives us no reason to think that God himself isn't the cause of the laws in the end.
Right. If you have the bag of marbles and each marble is a universe, who's holding the bag in that one?
Yeah. So here's the issue, right? Can you have laws without a lawmaker, right? And he's suggesting that Hawking's and his theory doesn't give us any reason to not believe that there is a lawmaker,
right,
that has made the laws,
right,
right.
You can go farther and say that Hawking's almost accidentally argues for the existence of God. In fact, Romans 1 tells us that everyone believes that, so they operate kind of in their worldview with those kind of preconceptions, and they borrow from the Christian worldview to operate. But here, Stokes is just saying that he doesn't make his case. If you're trying to say God is guilty of not existing, he's failed in his attempt.
Right. Number one, just because there are M theory posits all of these quantum fluctuations. Number one, and he puts this aside, instrumentalism doesn't allow you to it's a non-realist position, so you can't. It doesn't say whether or not these various non-observables exist. God clearly exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, God is non-observable, so it can't even comment on that, right? And secondly, it's hard to see that these quantum fluctuations, and the universes that they produce, why not we say that God is is the source of those?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's no way to say that either, right?
Right.
That they didn't come from God, right? And so there's no reason to believe that God himself isn't the cause, then, thirdly, of the laws of the various universes, because, if you have a law, you would expect the lawmaker type of thing, right? And so, yes, you're right. He's claiming here that Hawkins really doesn't make his case that God doesn't exist, right? Yeah. Next one is Lawrence Krauss.
Yeah, our good friend Lawrence Krauss. He's kind of a curmudgeon, as presented here, and I've seen interviews and debates, and he tends to be curmudgeon-y a bit. So Lawrence Krauss, again, takes the M theory, but however, he doesn't use the M theory. In fact, Krauss is not keen on any form of string theory. Rather, he uses good old-fashioned quantum field theory. So again, our biggest problem with Krauss is he says, nothing produced everything, but then when you drill down and you figure out that, well, he's using the term nothing for us plebes down here at the base of reality who don't understand when scientists say nothing, they actually mean something. He means when he says nothing, he means empty space. So all life in the universe arose from this empty space. All planets, all light, everything came about from this empty space. So he even says, when I want to be clear about what kind of nothing I'm discussing at the moment. This is the simplest version of nothing, namely empty space. Now me, and I'm a plebe here. The simplest version of nothing is nothing.
and right. So that's it. So nothing is nothing, right? So
Right.
if the simplest version is nothing, then the question is then what is he gives us something. It's empty space.
Right. He jumpstarts his own thing. It's you wake up and all of a sudden life is here. Right. So Stokes goes on to say that empty space isn't nothing, clearly. And then we kind of get the curmudgeon Krauss here. He says, once again, I realize that those who wish to continually redefine the word so that no scientific definition is practical, a.k.a. you want accuracy in your definitions, this version of nothing, empty space, doesn't cut the mustard. And he goes on to blame Plato and Aquinas as well. But so, again, utilizing the word nothing, it reads, it's kind of like reading the headline of news articles and assuming that you got it. Right. Did the Boston bomber get radicalized through the watching of Sesame Street? And then you're like, oh, he must have gotten radicalized through the messages of Sesame Street, and you read the article. It's like no actual radicalization was found, but they put a question mark on the end of it.
Right. So it's up for debate.
Well, at least people were discussing it, so it's a possibility. So we should pull our children away from Sesame Street.
Yeah. So empty space is something. Right. What is empty space?
Yeah. It at the very least, you have to say it has is curved. It contains energy. It's expanding. It has properties. Is what he's saying. Yeah. So when Krauss refers back to saying, well, even Plato had that type of thing. For Plato, space was something as well, and indeed something really strange.
So empty space is more than just nothing. Empty space has properties. Empty space is expanding. Empty space curves, right? It contains energy. It's more than just nothing.
Right.
So,
in fact, it doesn't even approximate nothing, is what he says. Right. I mean, and no one would say that. You would say, how did that cake get there? That's in my fridge. Well, it came from nothing. oh, okay, so it just like appeared there and on the platter. Well, no, there was this bowl, and then things just started to fly in from it out of nowhere. Well, hold on. You're talking about a bowl. Where'd the bowl come from? Well, you need the bowl there because that's what contains everything.
Yeah, because space contains it.
Yeah, I understand. I understand that, but there are it's made of glass and is able to be baked at a certain temperature. Like again, the empty universe is this kind of shell container, but it still has properties. So he goes to say that the lesson is clear. This is Krauss. Quantum gravity not only appears to allow the universe to be created from nothing, meaning in this case, I emphasize the absence of space and time, it may require them. Nothing in this case, no space, no time, no anything, is unstable. Then he says, I notice how that even goes beyond any existing quantum field theory to a theory of quantum gravity, something that quantum field theory cannot yet provide. So again, this is the issue with the quantum field theories is they tend to make bigger claims than what they're able to prove.
And you still get the law issue, the law problem, the
right.
law question, right?
Yeah.
Where are these laws that are doing these things come from, right?
Yeah. So then he goes on to talk about where the laws came from, and David Albert, a philosopher of physics, kind of comes back against Krauss on this and says, what if he were in a position to announce, for instance, that the truth of quantum mechanics laws can be traced back to the fact that the world has some other deeper property X? Wouldn't we still be in a position to ask why X rather than Y? And is there at last such question? Is there some point at which the possibility of asking any further such questions somehow definitively come to an end? How would that work? What would that look like? So he's still having to come to grips with these, as Hawkins did, these meta laws. So why is the universe curved? Why does it contain these things? Why is it able to expand? So he's still frustrating the question.
Yeah, and so the real issue then is, what do laws do?
Right.
Or what can they do? Or what do they allow for? Right.
Laws tell us how the elementary stuff of the universe is arranged, how it got there. As the laws of physics simply tell us how the universe behaves, not how it was born. So that's the issue.
So laws have nothing to do with their own origin,
right,
or the origin of anything.
The speed limit. Why is the speed limit there? Well, it's to make sure that people don't go so fast, and they've determined that these turns on these roads, a vehicle can take it at this amount. Well, but no, like, why are they there? Ultimately, how did they get there? At what point? Oh, okay. Well, these lawmakers came about.
Yeah. Again, laws cannot explain themselves.
Right.
Laws tell us how things are, working and operating, and how they, that sort of thing. But they don't explain themselves.
Right. It's one of the really good points in Lyell's book, Ultimate Proof of Creation, where he talks about DNA and how DNA is information. And there you have, life arises out of life because, here's the information. It changes over time, and small changes produce this. But go back to the original. What do you mean information? Why is there information? And information in any other regard is a sign of intelligence that directs that information. Because if it's just random things bumping into each other, we wouldn't call ping pong balls in an air vacuum that bounce around as
information.
As informational. But if someone were to manipulate the ping pong balls so that they all went in a straight line and then their movement looked like a circle, we would say, oh, that's odd, and that's clearly had to come from someone. So again, it's all pointing back to even more, I think, the possibility of the existence of a lawmaker. So he says, would we have an explanation for why there's something rather than nothing? Unfortunately, no. We'd still have a problem of why there is an eternal bounding universe rather than nothing at all. To put it more provocatively, the question of why there's something rather than nothing simply isn't a scientific question at all. Maybe it's a philosophical one.
Yeah, so the question is, all right, fine, let's assume that the universe has always been here. Okay, fine. Now the next question then is, why is there something rather than nothing.
Right.
Right?
Again, it's not the what. Like going back to the billiard balls, sometimes we say, oh, why did that happen? We say, oh, the one billiard ball pushed against the other one. That tends to be the what. We're asking the why does it do that? Why do the objects in motion affect each other? And kind of the more basic question.
Why is the universe here?
Right.
Well, it's just here.
To move the billiard balls.
Yeah, right. So rather than simply, it's not it's that, and that now we're getting into philosophy when we start asking those types of questions.
Right.
We're no longer, technically, physics. We're getting into philosophical questions, right? So the next point that he wants, even with Krauss's something from nothing and equals nothing or whatever, equals everything. I think, right? Something from nothing equals everything. Right?
Zero equals the string of equations.
0 plus nothing equals everything or something like that. I don't know. So why do we accept these types of things, I guess? And he says, why then are we so susceptible to such unwarranted claims by scientists? He says a big part of the problem is a lack of, and here's his theme and thesis of the book, a lack of studied skepticism, right? We've become all too willing to believe metaphysical pronouncements based on scientific results. Scientifically proven, quote, scientifically proven, is our new, quote, thus saith the Lord.
Right.
And to be sure, science has gotten weirder and weirder, and this is largely because the world is even more so. So the success to strangeness ratio, right, seems to remain constant. As the success piles up, so does the strangeness. But tracking the world's weirdness isn't the problem. The problem occurs when we add to the weirdness, right?
We don't need to do that. Truth is stranger than fiction in this case.
And it's difficult enough on its own, and it's weird enough on its own. When we start adding, and by the way, everything came from nothing, weirdness, wait a minute. Right? Why are we doing that? The mere fact that scientists can propose quantum fluctuations, he tells us, of nothing, and do so with such straight faces is pretty alarming, right? Come on, folks, right?
And they're the ones to look back and say, oh, you believe the humors of the body is what caused sickness. We're so far advanced that, no, see, there are these little itty-bitty things that you can't see unless you have certain, training and technology, and those are the things that cause you to be sick. These little creatures. Oh, okay, all right.
All right. So we've been slowly, he says, conditioned like the proverbial, frog in the boiling pot. Slowly conditioned to believe that anything is possible, right? And so the problem is discerning legitimate strangeness from literal nonsense. And, of course, it's not easy. He says, I should also mention that we can't simply dismiss ideas because they're strange or uncomfortable. This is why any skepticism we adopt should be studied skepticism, right? We should avoid the reactionary, it's false because science says it, which is silly.
Right. Yeah. So we don't need to factor in other new things that science doesn't say. Again, it's okay for science to have limits, is what we said in the last episode, and staying within that purview is just fine. When it attempts to go outside those bounds is when we get into trouble. And it doesn't seem like it almost seems like the world or people want to look at these types of experts in their field and say, okay, now make claims about morality or laws of logic or why the universe exists. And so you have them go on podcasts and shows and talk about how I saw the Matrix, and that's a really good point. I'm gonna we're all in the Matrix. That's fine. So we always need to be careful of that. Then he goes on to say, or to ask the question, could science ever show that God doesn't exist? Could it show that naturalism is true? Again, that's the main point of most of these scholars is naturalism, the belief that all there is physical reality. To be sure, scientific evidence can potentially tell against certain specific religious dogmas where the doctrines make the claim about the physical world. So that's the only time when they can enter into.
So when these doctrines touch on claims about the physical world, then science can opine on that, because it's talking about the physical world.
Right. Yeah. Science and religion, he says, can dialogue, as they say. Moreover, beliefs about God can certainly affect the epistemic plausibility of a scientific hypothesis. For example, a trenched belief that naturalism will make certain theories more attractive, epistemically speaking. And he says, take, for example, blind and unguided evolution. It's the only game in town for unbelievers. So no matter what the evidence, it has got to bear a lot of explanatory weight. And I forget the name of the guy. He's not a believer, but I think he's from the UK, and he just takes evolution to task. In fact, he tends to be sometimes on panels where it's evolution and creation or evolution intelligence design. He tends to be the only atheist on the side, and he talks about how terrible evolution is, and I'll find him and put him up in the show notes for this. So even when you have someone who doesn't believe in God, it's the ability to object to evolution and just kind of all the claims that it makes. Yep. There you go. See, that's why we keep Tony around for those names. To take a more extreme example, if you begin by assuming that naturalism is true, making this a principle, or what we call an axiom, so kind of like that foundational point, then it is no wonder that one of your conclusions would be that God doesn't exist, or that he didn't create the cosmos, right? And that makes sense. We say that God made the universe. He's a non-physical being. He enters into creation, and evolutionists come along and say the only thing possible are physical things. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Yeah. Well, right, and it's something that
if indeed the only thing that's possible is not physical things, then clearly God doesn't exist. Yes, right.
And that's what C.S. Lewis claimed in his really good book Miracles, and it's almost a presuppositional book. Is if your worldview doesn't allow for things like miracles, when I tell you that Jesus rose from the dead, your automatic assumption is, well, that's not possible. Why? Well, because people don't rise from the dead. Right. Okay, well, that's a great non-starter. Well, I believe that no one rises from the dead. Okay, well, I told you someone did. Well, I know that's not possible.
Yeah, because miracles can't happen.
Right. There's this really, really good quote that I wanted to kind of read the whole thing because it really shows from Lee Mullen, this doctor who wrote 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity. Actually, I don't know if he's a doctor. So he wrote this. And listen to all the points that he makes concerning a worldview. And I think it doesn't lack presuppositionalism here. So we humans are the species that make things. So when we find something that appears to be beautiful and intricately structured, our almost instinctive response is to ask, who made that? The most important lesson to be learned if we are to prepare ourselves to approach the universe scientifically is that it is not the right question to ask. So that's a no question.
No.
Yeah. It is true that the universe is as beautiful as it is intricately structured, but it cannot have been made by anything that exists outside it.
Okay.
For by definition, the universe is all there is, and there can be nothing outside of it. And by definition, neither can there have been anything before the universe that was caused it, for if anything existed, it must be part of the universe. So the first principle of cosmology must be there is nothing outside the universe. Wow. Where did you get that from? Yeah. I mean, just all those.
Everybody knows that.
Yeah. Oh, it's by definition. The universe.
That's the definition of the universe. Yeah. There's nothing else outside of it.
Uni, one verse, talk, out of one word, the universe came about. There you go. Yeah. See, I can do it too. It's just that quote was, I mean, people who research books for publication and find these quotes, I mean, they're perfect. And so just the amount of hopefully this drives in the point that it's not about facts. It's not about who's able to glob on to. Okay, we've pulled fossils away from those evil evolutionists, and now we can use it as evidence for God, and we can point to the manuscripts of the Bible, but they can pull in the claims that Jericho never fell in the way that the Bible describes. it's not that. It's about, again, the first point, the axiom, the principle is about worldview and how important it is. So then Stokes goes on to say, we should all admit that our beliefs about God either way can influence our attitudes towards scientific evidence, which I think that quote pretty much proves.
Yeah. So the main reason why you religious folks believe in God, is his rejoinder here, is that you think he's the best explanation for the universe's existence and working. That is, your reason for believing God in the first place is at least largely that he's the best way to account for the ways things are. And so now he's going to question that assumption.
Right.
The reason why people believe in God is because they think that God is the best explanation for things, right? Is that true? So here's the question we need to ask ourselves. Is that what brought you to God? Is that what caused you to believe in God? That you did this philosophical movement that says, well, let's see, everything needs an explanation, and therefore God seems to be the best explanation. Therefore, I believe in God. Is that the way most people come to believe in God?
Right. Yeah, and that's
he's
not to
going to
say
question
right.
that.
That's not to say that some people don't, in at least in that fashion. Some people do look at the evidence, and there might be a movement towards intelligent design, but things like when we say God here, I think he has a specific definition of who God is, and that tends to be the biblical God, the God who saves. And so moving from just even intelligent design to the biblical Christian God, I think it would be hard pressed for someone to say, I looked up at the moon, realized that it is there, and it hasn't traveled as far along the way as what we would think when the universe is, or the Earth is so many years old, and therefore God exists and Jesus Christ is his son, and there's more to it, and clearly that's even what the Bible talks about too.
Yeah.
And so, as we would expect with Dr. Stokes, he brings in our good friend Plantica, and
because the question is, how many people believe that
right.
that God believe in God mainly because they think that God's actions is the best explanation for the all the universe, and he says not many.
Right. Maybe a few people accept religious beliefs strictly on the basis of what they take the evidence to be. Perhaps, for example, this is true of Antony Flew. In fact, it probably goes the other way, since many people already believe in God. He's going to be the first round draft pick for an explanation of the universe. So that's not to say that he doesn't try additional support from the belief in God, from his belief that there's an explanation for the universe. But weakening or even defending my belief that God is the universe's cause wouldn't take away my grounds for believing that God exists. It might cause me some consternation, but it's not the primary belief. God is not a scientific hypothesis in his case or in our cases, and this is probably true of most believers.
Or a philosophical hypothesis, necessarily.
Right.
Right. So my belief in God is not, he says personally, speaking for himself, my belief in God is not built upon the belief that he created everything. And I would suggest that many believers, if they think through, didn't come to believe because they thought through philosophical or even scientific problems. Some have, right? But most people, they don't think about those things, right? In fact, the scriptures tell us that, that we suppress the truth, that God has revealed himself. So we automatically, right? This is the sensus divinitatis that he talked about in the previous chapter. We already have some knowledge, that God exists, right? And we have to suppress that and come up with some crazy ideas, right? And something from nothing ideas in order to get around those particular beliefs. But it's kind of like, I don't do a logical argument to show that this table exists. I believe the table exists, right? That kind of stuff. Now, I do, and I don't even argue, well, let's see, I see the table, I hear the table, I feel the table, therefore, I don't do that, right? It's just, I know the table is here, right? I don't do those types of things. And he suggests most of us don't do that kind of stuff with the existence of God.
Right. So Hawking and Krauss' arguments were entirely successful, even if they were entirely successful. The most they may have shown is that it's not possible that God didn't create the universe. So not quite there. Krauss on the matter says, without science, everything is a miracle. With science, remains the possibility that nothing is. Again, going back to nothing. So, so he brings up this example, and it's probably not the best example considering what we now know of Mother Teresa. But let's assume that what we think we know of Mother Teresa is true. If you've always thought that Mother Teresa was a moral hero, someone wanders by, just someone, and randomly tells you that we don't know, that it's not astronomically improbable that she was a complete hypocrite, would you be impressed? Even if Hawkins and Krauss have shown that it's not impossible that the laws of physics alone can account for the existence of the universe, which I don't think they have come close, we shouldn't be impressed. So just as we wouldn't be impressed by someone trying to upend one of your kind of basic beliefs that is strongly held, just because a couple people tell you doesn't mean that we should kind of take the celebrities, scientists as kind of the be end all.
And so in the last section here, the next to the last section here, he talks about seers versus crafts people, right? And the issue here is, he said at the beginning of the early 19th century, in the early 1900s, we had people who were seers, right? Who were philosophers, natural philosophers who were attempting to come up with these theories, and they understood logic and philosophy were important in terms of coming up with physical theories. Since then, since about the 40s, he says, what we have are not seers like Einstein, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, and that sort of thing, but craftspeople, right? People who, instead of masters of philosophical creativity, these scientists were technical virtuosos, right? Capable of astounding mathematical feats, but not as adept at fundamental conceptual issues. Right? And so he suggests we really need both, and we really need seers, and we've moved away from seers, and we think that, the crafting is the way to go. Right.
And what we looked at right from the 19th, 20th century for those that kicked out philosophy and theology from the academic world, so that philosophy wasn't as stagnant as it was. You kind of have this separation that if you're a scientist, you're not really thinking about the bigger picture stuff. You're just trying to prove string theory, supersymmetry, all those things, and that's what gets you the Nobel Prize. Thinking about the beauty of the universe, like Einstein did, like Newton did, like Aristotle, and all the rest of them before them, had this kind of well-rounded approach where kind of the metaphysics also informed upon the physics.
Yeah. All right, so he ends this chapter and this section on science and God, and he says, "Here we stand. Remember that I began the book as Captain Obvious, pointing out that unbelievers take reason and science very seriously. In parts 1 and 2, however, we've seen that many unbelievers aren't nearly as skeptical as they let on, and he suggests as they should be, right? It seems to me that they should, given their avowed eagerness to follow reason, be rather more skeptical about important matters like sense perception, reason, and science, and much less about claims that science shows that God doesn't exist, right? But suppose he says that I've been entirely off base, right? That indeed all of this stuff is indeed the case.
Right.
Suppose further that science gives us the genuine goods on physical reality, and that it tells us important things about non-physical reality, namely that there isn't one. Right?
That's offering a lot for what he's just gone over.
Right? Yeah. So he says, let's just say, okay, we'll allow him all that. He says, so suppose all this is true. What follows from all of this, right? And so he thinks it's going to be something pretty unsettling that follows from this, right?
So again, it seems odd that a Christian is calling unbelievers to be more skeptical, and obviously he's doing it in a consistent with his own worldview, but he's also calling them to be consistent as well. And so he would say something along the lines of, why aren't scientists as skeptical with their theories as they should be? And we know that he he would say that this is the point of the book because we also interviewed him.
Yeah.
And that's for the next 2 weeks is what we're going to be airing for part 1 and part 2 of our interview with Dr. Mitch Stokes, who was gracious enough to come on our podcast and talk with us for a good amount of time on himself and the book. So it's not just going to be an interview about the book, although there will be some spoilers for the next section. So that's why we kind of split it up between the two parts. The first part's kind of covering who he is and the science section of the book, and the first part of the book as well. We can't forget that part. And then the second part is going to be on the morality subject. And so if you want to save that for last, we wanted to kind of get that out there because it was good enough to realize what we were doing and offer an interview for us.
Right. So next time we'll hear from Dr. Stokes himself as we talk to him about this particular book. So make sure you tune in. So if you like what we're doing and you like this, please subscribe, hit the like button, and let your friends know. And we'll be talking with Dr. Stokes next time. So we will see you next time.
And there'll still be a few short clips in there too that you can share as well. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.